Good morning and a very warm welcome to the 9th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in 2021. Can I please ask everyone to make sure their mobile phones and other devices are switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Can I say that I am working without Wi-Fi this morning, and hopefully to be aware that I won't be able to monitor either the panel or members who Agenda item 1 is a and members can
Convener, if I may, your audio seems to be cutting in and out. I don't know if that's because you're inadvertently pressing mute or if I need to step in.
I think we should have you step in, Daniel, if that's the case. Yeah, sorry, thank you.
No problem at all. And if committee members and witnesses could be patient as we seamlessly transition, I'll assume convening the meeting. Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to the 9th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in 2021. Can everyone please ensure that their mobile phones and other devices are switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. So our first agenda item is a decision on taking business in private. Can I ask if members object to taking item 3 in private? I see no such objections, and so therefore we will take item 3 in private. Agenda item 2, evidence session with the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland. So this morning we are very pleased to have the Commissioner, but more importantly 3 young advisors with him this morning. So can I welcome to the meeting Bruce Adamson, Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland, Col McHale, Young Advisor, Jonathan Dorat, Young Advisor, and Abigail McGill, Young Advisor. Bruce and the Young Advisors have asked if they can make some brief opening remarks before we move on to questions this morning. So can I come to Col first? Col.
Good. Hello? Yeah.
Hello.
So, I'm Col. I joined as a young advisor to the Commissioner's Office a year and a half ago. I'm from the Borders, and I think I joined because around here I feel like there's a dearth of opportunities for young people, and I couldn't kind of pass up on this one. So 12 months ago, before the pandemic hit, we had, as young advisors, just finished leading on and working through developing the office's strategic plan. We'd identified as our priorities poverty, mental health and climate justice. Then the pandemic hit and our office had to change what we were doing and how we were working, obviously. It's been an extraordinary year, which is an immense cliche, but I can still remember my mate telling me that the pandemic was just like the flu. And at that point, I had no idea what COVID was, so probably agreed with them. Next week, it'll be a year since the Deputy First Minister announced that schools will be closing and we moved all our work online. Since then, we've been highlighting the disproportionate effect of the lockdown on children and young people, for example, those experiencing poverty or those with disabilities and additional support needs. I think the impact of restrictions on young people has been incredibly understated, and it's largely because we're not as vulnerable to the virus as other generations. We talk a lot about a mental health pandemic amongst young people as we ease restrictions, but we never really explore what that means or why we have it. Lockdown's been incredibly difficult for young people. I mean, on the 20th of March, we went from seeing our pals at school every day to seeing no one overnight. Then the media and others blamed us for a rise in cases when we went back to school. You're obviously not keeping 2 metres apart, they would say. Anyone who's been in a school of 1,000 pupils knows how impossible that is to do. And then you'd have the occasional rave or mass gathering, and it would be over-publicised and blown out of proportion, and our whole generation would be the villain of the pandemic again. People talked like our exams last year wouldn't matter, that because we hadn't sat them, they would be undervalued. And then when university students went back, they were blamed for a rise in cases. But by my interpretation, they had no choice but to go back. I think that, and then over autumn, we had the Rule of Six, and it was perfect. We could socialise safely outside. And then over winter, this changed. We could only see one friend outside. And I think from my experience, it doesn't really work for young people in social groupings, because that's not how socialising works for us. We couldn't understand how call centres could legally open, but I couldn't see more than one friend at a safe distance. These are just a few of the issues that we'd love to talk about today, which explain how difficult lockdown has been for young people. And I think it's worth saying that yes, the First Minister's announcement yesterday about being able to see 4 people from 4 households for 12 to 17-year-olds is incredibly welcome, and it's building back to that Rule of Six that we had earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Col. Can I now turn to Bruce?
Thank you, Deputy Convener, and thank you, Committee. It's wonderful to be with you today. I tell people every day that I've got the best job in the world to promote and safeguard the rights of children and young people all across Scotland, but that job's been really hard over the last year. In April last year, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child warned of the grave physical, emotional, psychological impacts on children of the pandemic, and asked states to focus on this not just as a health crisis, but as a human rights crisis, and particularly focus on economic, social and cultural rights. As Col's demonstrated in his introduction, and as you said, Deputy Convener, at the start, the most important people in my office are the young advisors and the other young people we work with, and it's a huge source of pride to me to be working alongside amazing young human rights defenders. And Jonathan, Abigail and Cole are here today, but they're part of a much wider group representing young people from across Scotland. And they've spoken in their communities and been strong leaders in their communities, but also at the national and the highest international level, speaking at the UN and other places. And so they're a real credit to Scotland. And I think that it's important that we recognise the over 1 million children and young people across Scotland, the amazing sacrifice that they've made over the last year, and that they really understand the important role that they've been playing to protect public health, sticking to the rules and showing their real resilience and creativity and self-sacrifice. And I think that it's really important that we put them at the centre of all decision-making, because as Cole said, I think that their voices have been quite absent in decision-making, and their rights also not properly considered in decision-making. Again, as Cole said, that the impact on some has been much worse than on others, and so disabled children, young people, care experienced, young carers, those in poverty in particular. And again, I think it's really important that we focus on the impact on rights of those in poverty, and recognising that more children are living in poverty, more children are suffering poor mental health, and more children are dealing with bereavement. Because when we closed the school buildings for most children, that may have been necessary to protect life and public health, but we needed to do more to ensure that children's rights were properly respected within that, because school and early years communities aren't just about learning, they're also places of support and places of safety. And so very much look forward to discussing more with the committee on some of those issues. The immediate priorities for us last year, a year ago, as Cole said, when we needed, like everyone else, to adjust our planning and work differently, the original priority was on the emergency legislation going through, particularly the impact of school closures and early year closures, and the disproportionate impact of some of those restrictions on children and young people, things around school meals and getting financial assistance to families, the ongoing concerns around digital exclusion, the making sure that children of key workers and those children in vulnerable situations were actually getting the support they needed, and particularly children with additional support needs. And the point that I really hope we can expand on that Cole mentioned about the importance of social interaction for children's development, and the right to play, the right to congregate and be with peers, that's so important for education but also development as well. And the big issue, of course, around the Scottish Qualifications Authority and how we assessed and recognised the achievements of children while schools were taking place online. A couple of other things I'll just mention briefly are the really important work that we did alongside the Observatory for Children's Rights in Scotland of undertaking an independent children's rights impact assessment on the impact of the COVID pandemic. Some of the work that we did alongside the independent advisory group on policing, and I think that's really important in terms of how children and young people's behaviour was supported by the work of the police in terms of the rules. We continued some of our work on things like our investigations, and so look forward to discussing some of that. And internationally, I think really importantly, we've continued to work very closely with the United Nations and the Council of Europe. We're also currently the chair of the European Network of Ombudspersons for Children, so that's 43 similar organisations to ours, children's commissioners across wider Europe. And that's been a really powerful network for finding out what's been happening in other countries and working together to set some common standards. And so some really exciting work there. And probably the most exciting thing that's happening, I think, at the moment is the fact that we've still managed to push ahead with the bill to incorporate the Convention on the Rights of the Child into our domestic law, and the Parliament will be asked to consider that at stage 3 next week. That is the most important thing that we can do to secure and respect, protect and fulfil children's rights, and will make a significant difference when it comes into force later this year, I hope, if Parliament approves it next week. Both in terms of addressing the immediate concerns within the crisis, but also long-term cultural change to put children's voices and their rights at the heart of our work. And I think there's some beautiful symmetry in the fact that it comes almost exactly 18 years since the creation of my office by the predecessor committee to this one of the very few committee bills that the Parliament's brought forward. And so it's almost exactly 18 years since the Parliament showed its commitment to children and young people by creating the Children's Commissioner, and next week we'll be able to renew that commitment in the most powerful way by incorporating the Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I now turn to Abigail? Do you have Abigail? Is she able to make an opening remark? Well, I don't hear anything. We'll maybe try and come back. Jonathan, would you like to make your introductory remarks?
Yeah, hello, I'm Jonathan, and I've been a young advisor to the Children and Young People's Commissioner in Scotland for just about a year and a half now. And I live in Shetland, so it's been actually this year, due to COVID, easier for me to take part in the meetings because it meant I wasn't disadvantaged by travel or anything. And so this year, due to COVID-19, I think it was the most important year of all, really, to champion children's rights and make sure that children's rights were being taken seriously. My work with the office and the Young Advisors Group last year and this year is really focused on taking part in the European Network of Young Advisors at the end of last year, where myself and other members of our Young Advisors Group represented CYPCS and Scotland at the European Network of Young Advisors, at which we discussed with young people from across Europe on rights issues that were brought up by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we made recommendations to the Children's Ombudsman people across Europe on the importance of child rights impact assessments. And child rights impact assessments became the key focus of ENOC that year. And in CYPCS in Scotland, we hosted the ENOC conference in November last year, albeit online. And this year, Bruce has been elected as chair of ENOC, and their work again is focused this year on COVID-19 recovery across Europe and working with a shared learning and understanding from young people. And I think it's important that we've been able here in Scotland to take part in a European project such as ENIA. I look forward to answering the questions today at the committee. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I believe Abigail dropped out momentarily, but we have her back. Abigail, would you like to make your introductory remarks?
Oh, sure. I'm very sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Wi-Fi's just not anyone's friend this morning, apparently. So I've also been a young advisor for about a year and a half, and my opening remarks are about the SQA and the exam cancellations, because there has been a chronic lack of uncertainty for young people over how they're going to be assessed. It seems to differ across every school, which is inevitably going to lead to unfair attainment when it comes to results in August. The office is very concerned that there are still students from last year awaiting on appeal or have been disadvantaged by the appeal process from last year. We're just as concerned that the appeals process this year will not be fair either, because everything's just really been up in the air and nothing's came back down. It's not. The SQ have said they're working with the office, however, they're not in the current process that they're using for appeals are not rights compliant, specifically the right to redress and remedy. Our future seems to be very much out of our hands at the minute. I think, as Col said, we've been treated as the villains with the pandemic. We've been said that it's basically our fault, and I think because of that there's been a lack of sympathy and a lack of understanding for just how much this is affecting our education, because we've been brought up to realise that exams are everything. So for young people right now, this is their world and they've got no say in what's happening with it. They're not being really told what's going on. There's still people that don't know what's going on, and that's just very, very unfair. It's not particularly rights compliant either. It's been very distressing and disheartening for young people. I think a lot of people have lost a lot of motivation this year and their studies have been affected by it. I look forward to answering the questions, as Jonathan said.
Thank you very much, Abigail. I'd now invite committee members to put an R in the chat function if they would like to ask questions. And just to clarify for our guests this morning, if they would like to respond to any of the questions once they've been asked by committee members, could they too simply just go to the chat function in Blue Jeans and put an R in the chat, and I will know to come to them so that they can provide their remarks. So I'll begin by going to Ian Gray, who I believe is going to ask questions that relate to some of the remarks Gail has. Ian Gray.
Thank you very much, Daniel. The committee, not surprisingly, have spent quite a lot of the last year looking at schools, the closure of schools, the reopening, and then the closure again to face-to-face learning, the remote learning that's been put in place, and the reasons and the evidence that the government have used in order to take these decisions. So I'd just like to, a number of those opening contributions suggested that the young advisors and the Commissioner felt that in taking these decisions, the rights of young people had not been given enough attention. And I would just like to ask what it is they feel about the way in which education has been handled through the pandemic, which has failed to take account of those rights, and what they would like to have seen done differently, which would have paid more attention to those rights that have been abrogated or compromised.
Which of the panelists would like to? Bruce, shall I turn to you in the first instance?
Thank you, Deputy Convener, and I know that the young advisors will want to come in very strongly on this as well. But to answer your point, one of the things that we were really concerned about was the lack of children and young people's voices in the decision making, and we know that one of the key things about ensuring that education lives up to the right to education, the purpose of education, which is to develop children to their fullest potential, and goes much further than just pure educational attainment, but actually is an holistic right, which is about developing children to their full potential, including kind of emotionally and in terms of things like physically as well. And we know that works best when children and young people are involved in the design of education and the delivery of education and peer-to-peer support. And so what we would have liked to have seen and what didn't happen was the strong voice of children and young people in all of those decisions that affected them. So in terms of when we knew that schools might have to close, children should have been right at the heart of those discussions about what learning outside of school looked like And so strong focus that we need to put now on children's participation in decision making. And Scotland's been a world leader in this. And then suddenly the pandemic came along, and all of the great work that's been done over recent years, recent decades in Scotland, that amazing good practice seemed to disappear, and children were just not being involved. The other key point would be, as the young advisors have focused on, and Jonathan talked about at the international level, the use of tools like children's rights impact assessments. And so this would have been a really good way in which government and others making decisions would have been able to assess the impact of their decisions against children's rights standards. And again, despite some progress in recent years, those really just dropped off and disappeared when it came to the pandemic and the crisis decision making. And that was a big reason as to why we did the independent children's rights impact assessment, because government and other decision makers weren't doing it. And so I'm really proud of that piece of work. It's now being replicated across wider Europe and Central Asia and other places. But that's a government responsibility to use the tools available to ensure that children's rights are assessed. And that needs to be a big part of future decision making. And I know that the others are really keen to come in on this as well. So I'll stop there.
Great. Can I bring in Jonathan and then Col? So Jonathan, please.
Thank you. As Bruce says, children's rights impact assessments is a document and a process that the government can take to make sure that they consider all of the rights of a child when they are making a decision. And having a child rights impact assessment, if it had been in place when the exams were cancelled or schools were closed, children's rights and young people would have been taken more seriously and considered. However, that wasn't the case. As myself being in school last year when the schools were closed, we felt there was a lack of communication from the government and SQA and other bodies to young people. Often schools being told that they were closing or things were changing at the same time as young people. So young people had nowhere to go to get further information because no one knew anything more than they did at the time. So I guess improving communication, but also at the onset of all of this, like the UNCRC Article 3 that everything must be in the best interests of the child. Like if we looked at like the closure of schools and cancellation of exams from a rights-based approach, maybe things would have been different if the best interests of the child had been taken seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. And Col, can I bring you in?
Yeah, of course. I think what Jonathan Bruce says is totally right. I think rights-based approach to learning, which is what we should be looking towards, involves young people at the heart of decision making. But at the very least, it involves young people having clarity, and young people didn't even have clarity throughout. We've not had clarity, as Abigail said. Everything's up in the air, and it hasn't came down yet. So clarity at the very least in decision making, ideally. I think that on what we could have done better. I think that when it's important to talk about this. I think that when the provisional plans were announced for how exams are going to go ahead, and National 5 exams were cancelled, and whereas higher and advanced higher exams were going ahead without the assignment element, National 5 was going to be based on continuous assessment. I think that continuous assessment is something that we should be looking towards building regardless of the pandemic. I think it removes the pressure cooker environment that we currently have. But I think just to have one qualification as continuous assessment and the other two as exams, I think it devalued National 5 qualifications immensely. And I think that by having only continuous assessment for Nat 5, but at higher and advanced higher, removing the assignment element of the course, which is the only element of the course which is done externally to exams, you're sending incredibly mixed messages about continuous assessment, because you're keeping it and removing it at different qualifications, and in the process devaluing your National 5s. So I think that could have been done better. And again, I think it's an issue of clarity and consistency.
Thank you. I know Kenneth Gibson has a supplementary on this area, but before I come to him, can I go back to you if he has further questions?
I'd like to ask a question specifically around the SQA and the alternative certification model which was put in place, and the work which has been done to put a different alternative certification model in place. I know that the Commissioner's Office have had particular concerns around the appeals procedure, and I think, I think Abigail said that the SQA have said they're working with the Commissioner's Office, but in fact that's not true in developing the procedures for next year. I'd just like to ask what they think the problems were with the appeals procedure last year, and what has to be done differently this year in order to take account of children's rights.
Can I ask who would like to respond to that? And at the risk of putting you on the spot, I would have a mild preference for coming to the young advisors before going to Bruce, if that's okay.
But I don't know, Abigail might want to say something. She talked about this in her opening remarks.
Abigail, can I bring you in?
Sure, you can. So I definitely think even before the appeals process, it really just seemed like lots of people, I know especially in my area, I know a lot of young people were disadvantaged, like majorly disadvantaged in ways that they should not have been disadvantaged. And for all you don't want to say it's a post-code law today, I understand, but it does really seem like that's what it was. And it kind of seemed like the SQA panicked because they were getting lots of backlash, and they just decided that they weren't going to change anything. First of all, they were going to give out wrong and inaccurate grades to people. And then they decided they were just going to give everyone the grade that they wanted, which wasn't fair. There didn't really seem to be any process in place, any procedures in place. And I understand that it must have been hard to very quickly do all of that, given that the pandemic is obviously a constantly changing scenario. We never really know what's going to happen next week. But it's not like there wasn't a 5-month heavy lockdown where something could have been mapped out, where kids could have been told, wherein young people in that first 5-month lockdown, no one knew what was happening. We weren't in schools. It was basically, you have to hope that what you've done up until now has been good enough, and we're not going to tell you how we're going to do it, and we're not going to tell you how you can fix it. As Col said, there's been a utter lack of clarity. No one got told what was happening. No one got told how the appeals process was working. Even afterwards, no one got told how to appeal. It was just speak to a teacher. They might sort it out for you, they might not. And some young people didn't talk to a teacher. Some people did and didn't get anything solved. And I feel like there just has to be more involvement with children and young people over how they perceive, and teachers how they perceive an appeals process to be fair, to overlook something before it becomes in place, to check it and to check that it is fair to the young people and it is rights compliant.
Did you feel it's any better this second time round or not?
I have absolutely no clue because I haven't been told anything about the appeals process this year. I barely know anything about the way assessments are going this year. My school knows basically nothing, and I know as much as they can give me. So I honestly could not tell you because I have no idea.
Thank you. Can I bring Bruce in?
Yes, thank you, and I strongly endorse your position of taking the young advisors first deputy convener. That's very much the way that we prefer to be working, and strongly associate myself with what Abigail's been saying. The concerns last year, I think have been well canvassed in terms of not having the systems in place, not having the proper discussions with children, young people, but also teachers and school leadership as well. And I think one of the big things that when I speak to young people about this is the lack of communication. And so what we need is real clarity in terms of the guidance being provided to schools, and also the communication with children and young people has got to be absolutely clear as we figure out the best way to recognise children's, young people's achievements and progress. The big remaining issue from last year, as I know the committee knows well, is around appeals and the lack of proper rights to a remedy for those children who still don't have the mark that they deserve. The inability to actually take a direct appeal, to actually present the evidence that may not have been included, or to explain more fully some of the reasons why the mark that they were given wasn't appropriate. And that direct route of appeal is absolutely essential for this year. So clear communication, involving children, young people and teachers in that decision, and then a really clear route of appeal. And I think the other really important thing about this year is it has been very different. And so we need a way of taking into account the fact that young people's experiences of education over the last year has been very different, particularly those who are experiencing poverty and those that haven't got access to some of the digital technology, which was so essential to education this year. We need a way of actually figuring out how we can properly recognise the amazing work that young people have been doing over the last year and help them to move on to the next stage of their education or future, wherever that may be. But I think that clear communication to children and young people is absolutely key, and clear guidance to schools, and then a clear route of appeal, and then working with each and every young person to support them to get to the next step needs to be a really strong investment in terms of properly recognising the right to education.
Thank you very much. And I believe Col would like to come on this topic as well.
Yeah, very briefly. I just think on the question about this year being different, I think it's worth noting that there is a fear, and I think fear is the right word amongst young people. That when we go back full time, or even on the 15th, that because we have missed so much time in school, what we are going to be met with is a month or a term, if you like, of assessment, so that the SQA so that teachers can generate enough evidence to give to the SQA. And I think that is scary for young people who are going from this kind of relaxed lockdown in which your routine is how you set it, to this kind of potential month of test after test after test. I mean, if you're doing 5 Highers or 6 Nat 5s, it has the potential to be hellish. I think that's worth saying.
Thank you very much. Can I ask if Ian Gray has any further questions?
No.
Great. Can I bring in Kenneth Gibson to ask a supplementary?
Panel, it was with regard to what was said kind of earlier on by Bruce and indeed others, and he emphasised the need for a strong voice for children and young people at the heart of the decision-making process in terms of how young people would be affected. And it was just about the practicalities of that. I mean, so who would the young people be exactly? For example, how would they be chosen as the voices of younger people to speak to, for example, local authorities or Scottish ministers? And would this take into account age, geography and social class, for example?
Can I ask which panellists would like to come in? Did I see your head nodding, Col? Would you like to come in on this?
I think of course it would any potential kind of champion for young people with regard to exams or a committee, if you like, would have to take into account geography. I mean, I think Jonathan's experience, for example, has been incredibly different to mine. I think it would have to also include social class. Imperative that it does, because of the disparities with regard to online learning and things. So, and I think that it would have to be representative. It would also have to be taken seriously enough in a way that, I mean, it goes without saying that it shouldn't be a tick box, but I think the SQA are very fond of surveys which consult young people, for example. But what we need is a body who has decisions that are taken, every decision taken by the SQA is run by a committee of young people, for example, which is representative, and then you do quite literally have young people at the heart of decision making. I don't really see an issue with that setup, and I think it would be representative.
I believe Jonathan and Abigail would like to come in on this as well. Jonathan, can I come to you?
On terms of speaking to young people and getting young people involved in the decision making, I know that at the very top level, I think it's the Education Recovery Group, there is a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament who sits on that, and that's definitely a good step forward that's happened since the first exams results fiasco. However, we did mention like a local authority level and in schools. I'm a firm believer that pupil councils are a very important way to have young people in school to be listened to by head teachers and their local authority. And I feel in the future, young people through things like that could reach out to local authority level to show what's happening in school and take part in local decision making on things like that at local authority level.
Thank you very much. Abigail, can I bring you in, please?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Col was saying, that you would have to obviously take in geographical into account, because as I know from talking to Jonathan, his experience has been completely different from mine. I don't live that far away from Col, but we still have completely different experiences of all of this. As he said, the SQ are very fond of surveys, but I feel like only certain people take the surveys. Very few people get the email for the survey, even less will actually bother to take it. And even then, I tend to find that the surveys are about the website and not your opinion on what's affecting your future. I think that currently later on today, I'm talking with my local authority about online learning, which I think is a really good step forward in that, and I'm really happy that the local authority have reached out and asked for young people. But you would have to take into the account that I am obviously a young advisor. I'm quite happy to speak out about all of this, and there's other people that, one, probably don't have the opportunity presented to them, two, wouldn't know how. So you would have to take that into account, as Col said, the class of it. And I think practicality could also be an issue in terms of, yes, we are young people, and yes, it could be difficult, but it's something that needs to be done regardless of how practical or impractical it is. It's something that needs to be done, and you just have to find a way to work with young people, and it is possible to find ways around the practicalities.
Thank you, Abigail. And can I come to Bruce on this point?
Thank you. I think this is a really important point, because it's probably my biggest disappointment is that Scotland was really, really good at this. This is something that Scotland's been a world leader in. We weren't starting from a standing start. We've got incredible civil society organisations who have done world-leading participative work. Children's Parliament, the Youth Parliament, which is very proud of saying it's a day older than the Scottish Parliament. At every level, we've got champions boards representing care experienced young people. We've got probably the strongest, to my mind, children's civil society in the whole world in Scotland, who have really been amazing at this. So the young people themselves were already there, and they were wanting to give voice to what was going on. We've also seen new groups like SQA Where's Our Say that have coalesced around particular issues, who have been a really strong part of this as well. And within schools, again, we've got Rights Respecting Schools, but also other programs as well. Every single school that I visit has strong participative approaches within the school as well. So the children and young people were already there, already really ready to give their voice, and already well supported, particularly through civil society organisations and schools. And so we should have tapped into that talent and the stuff that was already there and built it into decision making, because as Abigail said really clearly then, this goes right to the legitimacy of decision making. And yep, there are challenges. We're all moving online. Decisions did need to be made quickly, but we did have the tools there, and traditionally we've used them quite well. And something went really badly wrong as we went into crisis mode, and that we didn't use those tools that were available. And so it's great in the example that Jonathan's given, that now we're starting to do that by putting members of the Scottish Youth Parliament into the Education Recovery Group and other places. But that's been a really slow process, and I think that had we involved children and people in a more systemic way at the beginning, we would have got better decision making. And I think that's probably the biggest learning point for as we move through the rest of this pandemic and out of it.
Thank you. Before moving on to the next question, can I just ask one point of clarification? Abigail stated that the issue around lack of clarity didn't just pertain to the appeals process, but actually there continues to be a lack of clarity regarding assessment this year, both on behalf of candidates and teachers. Is that a view and a sentiment that's shared by the panel as a whole? Yes. Good. Thank you. That's an important point of clarification, and I think one that's important for the committee. I'll now bring in Jamie.
Hold on. Can I come back a second, just for a second, Chair? Thanks. Just a wee follow-up, actually. Thanks very much, Convener, for letting me back in. I mean, I myself actually served on Glasgow Schools Council as the first ever directly elected people representative from my school, elected by the pupils themselves. We had one parent, one teacher and one pupil from each school, and this session has just reawoken memories of that, actually, long buried. But the point of the question was just to say that, I mean, I'm very supportive of liaising with schools and ensuring that pupils are viewed, but we've got over 400 secondary schools in Scotland, and the issue is to ensure that the voice that's actually presented to government from our schools and young people is representative. That's the view. You know, I appreciate that, you know, that we have a Scottish Youth Parliament, but it's to ensure that these schools, that the voice of pupils are directly represented, so that we don't have a situation whereby we have people who are purporting to speak for younger people but don't necessarily represent the views of them. So it's just to try and look to see that what mechanism we can develop to ensure that that is indeed the case, and with a true democratic voice coming from our schools, as we did over 40 years ago when I served in such a capacity way back when.
Thank you, Kenny. I won't ask how long ago that was that you served as the school's representative, but there we go. Brilliant. Can I now bring in Jamie Green?
Thank you. My school experience was much sooner than that, thankfully, but still quite a long time ago. I've got sort of a couple of different questions, so not everyone needs to reply to each of them, so feel free to jump in if you think this question's best suited to you. I'm going to sort of do two questions. One is sort of looking back, and the other one, I think, more importantly, is looking forward, just to get you thinking about that. But looking back, I guess I want to ask what specific actions or measures were taken by the government in the past 12 months that you either wish had, I guess, not been taken or been handled very differently. And alongside that, do you feel that the interests of young people, in terms of their needs and interests, have been at the forefront of the decision making as we've gone through this awful past year? I'll just pick on someone if you don't wave at me. Bruce, you'll be first in line.
And don't feel if Jamie picks on them that you have to respond. I just like to reinforce that point. Would any of the young advisors like to speak to that first? No, Jonathan, can I bring you in, please?
I think of all the decisions that were made last year, I mean, the one that definitely comes to mind is the algorithm used by the SUA last year, that they thought that they could change marks and grades given to young people by teachers depending on previous attainment and basically where they lived. I think that decision, albeit taken by SUA and not directly by the government, I think that's definitely one of the most damaging ones that we see today. People didn't get into uni because of these grades, and people still haven't had access to a fair appeal because that decision was made, and that really just didn't take into account of any of young people's interests or rights at that stage, I think.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can I go to Bruce? And I saw Col raise his hand there, but I'll go to Bruce first.
Brilliant, and thank you. Always happy to be picked on, but also strongly encourage the young advisors to get their voices in first. So thank you for that. I think that it's been really challenging over the last year. Governments all over the world have struggled with this, but it goes back to me to the point around taking a rights-based approach, particularly around children's involvement and the use of tools like impact assessments, because I think the failure to do that led to some issues where children's rights weren't prioritised. And I think in terms of the rules themselves, particularly around socialisation, I'm hugely concerned about. So the focus on schools, and schools are so important for the vast majority of children and young people who are in schools. But the broader issues around how we say, if we can't be in the school building to protect public life and health, which children and young people fully understood, how are we going to ensure that their rights are respected in terms of education, but also in terms of the other rights, in terms of their rights to development, their right to socialise. And a lot of the decisions around the rules didn't really take into account the point that some of the young advisors made earlier, that children's peer relationships, young people in particular, are very different, and particularly through those older childhood years, that kind of socialisation in bigger groups. And we were quite slow to take some of those decisions in terms of recognising that the rules for them needed to be quite different. And so particularly when we were restricting the 12 to 17-year-olds in socialisation, which I understand is going to change at the end of this week. But that was a really important human rights point that we missed, I think, and it was because we weren't properly talking to children and young people about what was going to work for them, taking into account the public health risks. The really big one, though, is poverty, and poverty was the biggest human rights issue facing children and young people in Scotland before the pandemic, and we all knew that. We had the UN Special Rapporteur come over and tell us in great detail about the fact we needed to change to address poverty as a human rights issue, and then COVID came along and made things so much worse for families experiencing poverty. And as children then at home trying to access education and socialisation without the technology that they needed, and while it was very welcome that the government came in with a significant investment towards that, it was quite slow in my view. We could have made that decision much earlier, and we could have ensured that those devices and technology were gotten to children and young people much sooner, because the impact of that really problematic. The additional supports that children and families get through schools around things like school meals, but also access to things like counselling, access to other support, those being taken away, and the community-based supports as well that people get through sports clubs and arts and culture clubs and being in the community, all of that dropped away. And I don't think that we were quick enough in recognising those as important rights issues as well, and putting in place other supports for families. And so getting direct funding to families was really important. And I think we were a bit slow there, and I don't think we did enough to see social security as a children's rights issue, and addressing the impacts of poverty within the crisis, the pandemic, as a human rights issue. We need to move much quicker to be talking to families about what support they would need. And I think digitally and direct funding were two really big parts of that. And I think also in terms of the other supports that were really important, that in terms of things like child protection, where we were reasonably good in Scotland at getting contact and direct support to those families that we already knew needed extra support. But the big tranche of families, children and young people who suddenly needed support that they would have usually got from universal services, from being in school, from being in the community, families that were really struggling, we didn't do enough to try and identify and support them. So I think the bigger learning from this comes back to using those tools like impact assessment, participation, but really trying to involve children and young people in identifying some of those needs as well as some of the solutions.
Thank you very much. Jamie,
I know Cole. Yeah, I know Cole wants to pop in, so maybe I wondered if when you do bring to the first question specifically was, do you think that the restrictions have been disproportionately affecting young people? For example, you haven't been able to meet indoors since probably about last September for many people, which is around 6 months. And even then, there was only a short window of opportunity during the summer for people to meet indoors. Obviously, that restriction happened during winter when it's more difficult to meet outdoors anyway. So I just wonder when we looked at sort of blanket the restrictions that affected the whole of society, should we have been looking at this more from how will these restrictions affect young people specifically? So perhaps I might lump that in with the first question if some of our young people want to respond.
Actually, Jamie makes a good point. I did forget to come back to Cole there. Cole, can I bring you in first?
I think that's a really interesting point. I think the example that I'd go to is when we'd gone back to school in August, and we were sitting in classes of, say, you could sit in a class of 30 people, say, until October time, and at the start we didn't have masks on, for example, and at that point we could still only see 6 friends outside. So whilst I could see 30 of my friends, classmates, in 7 classes a day, and I could socialise with them at lunch with the attempt at distancing, but practically it's incredibly difficult. I think that's incredibly confusing. That you can socialise indoors at school, but I mean, as soon as you step out of those doors at 3:40, you can only see 6 of your friends. I think that's incredibly challenging, and I think that's an example of how young people haven't been at the centre of thinking and somewhat being neglected, I suppose. And also on that, I think there are issues that inevitably fall through the cracks. The specific example I'd go to is that 6th years this year, for example, are going to be staying at school until the 25th of June, which I mean, normally we would leave in early May when study leave starts and when exams finish. I think that's something that hasn't been talked about, that this is kind of the summer before you start uni. It's an important time or uni or whatever, further education, and it's an important time. We are going to be at school longer, and whether it's an issue or not, it hasn't been talked about or even necessarily acknowledged. I think that what Jonathan says about the algorithm is obviously incredibly important. I also think that there has been a certain neglect, and the schools example is what I'd go to in terms of not hypocrisy, but it's like it's not thought through from the perspective of young people, and whether that's because they've not been involved, I don't know. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I think that maybe hits the nail on the head, is that you wonder if some of these decisions were seen through the prism of young people, and whether they made sense in a way. And I think in wider society, a lot of the restrictions didn't always make sense at the time, even though people understood why they were necessary. So I think that's a very good point. But I want to look forward, I think, as well. And I wonder if there were any sort of main lessons you think we could learn from the experience. Whilst it has been, largely negative for most of society, I hope we can take some positives out of it. What would you like to see the government focus on as we hopefully emerge from the pandemic in the coming months or even years? And do you think we are geared up as a system to deal with the fallout of the last year and young people, specifically around mental health, for example?
I think we have the most amazing chance now than we have done ever before in terms of exams specifically, that we have 2 years we now have had a model of continuous assessment, and I think that this is a chance to look at reforming the education system in that regard, because I think that amongst young people certainly there is a perception that exams are outdated, that working for a year to be assessed on 2 hours of work in a pressure cooker environment in May doesn't work for people. It may work for some, but for the majority it just doesn't. And I think that the positive of the pandemic, if you like, is that we have this chance now. We've had to put these models in place, and we can use these building blocks for a new and perhaps more progressive, more enlightened, if you like, approach, and one that doesn't have its roots in Victorian education. I think that would be incredible.
Thank you, Col. I note that both Jonathan and Abigail would like to come in. Can I come to Abigail first, please?
I think I will probably kind of be coming off the back of what Col said there, but yeah, I think given that the way that education, changed so differently over the few years, I mean, probably the most recent example is probably changing standard grades to national 5s, etc., etc. Content gets changed all the time, and yet for God knows how long we've still been doing exams. It was a huge thing last year that the first time since 18 whatever exams have been cancelled, and I think that made a lot of people think, why are we still doing exams? Why has this not changed? And I think it did take a lot of, had the young people been involved in this decision and had a bit more clarity, I feel like this would have been a lot less of a stressful year for young people, given that we wouldn't have had it all relying on 1 2-hour exam or 5 2-hour exams, however many subjects you take. I think the continued assessment is something that really needs to be looked at, because I, for one, was overjoyed when I found out that we weren't doing exams. I was so calm, and it makes the year such a smoother ride. Slightly more heightened levels of stress, but it's easier. And I think if there's one positive thing we can take out of that, is that with all the stress and anxiety that has came to young people throughout this time, I think one thing that has been lessened is the fact that there's not going to be a huge exam in May. Our whole year, however many years you've been doing for one exam, does not come down to a single day, and we have to take a look at that and definitely involve some young people. This is not a group of adults sitting around discussing whether exams should be a thing. You have to get the views of young people to decide whether or not this is a widespread thing, or it could just be me and Cole's preference. You know, we're not two people representative of the entire young people of Scotland.
Thank you, Abigail.
Thank you. I think Jonathan wants, and I know Rona had a similar question around mental health, Deputy Convener, and I just wondered if that's something we maybe could cover off as well, because I think it's a really important issue for everyone, but also for young people.
Agreed. Jonathan, can I bring you in?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that point about mental health, because obviously a pandemic, like it's had a huge impact on young people's mental health. But added with that is the pressure from the school's disruption is also further impacting young people's mental health. I guess one positive I could take from this is that I don't know if this is fully across Scotland yet, but in Shetland I know that last October we got school counsellors, that service started, and that's been really good to see in our local community and in school, where young people can get support for their mental health in school. And I think that's really important to see. And obviously, as moving forward, that could possibly increase across the country and improve in the services offered to young people. Going forward as well, I think we could probably learn lessons from online learning, because, I mean, Scotland, we've always had the GLOW online learning system there, but it's never been tested like it has been this past year. And I think it showed quite a few flaws with online learning and how different schools across the country understand online learning to be, because I know from myself that I have a few live lessons with a teacher a week, but then some of the young advisors that I've spoken to from across Scotland don't have live lessons, or they've used different platforms, or some people have been expected to sit in live lessons the whole day. So that's just not fair to everyone. So I think in the future we need to look at, if we were ever to go back to online learning or use it as a blended system, we need to try and make it fairer to pupils across Scotland. And if you don't mind, I think I'll go back to that question, I can't remember who it was from, about making sure young people could be listened to at local authority level. I am also a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for Shetland, and I know in Shetland that the MSYPs have a place to sit on the local authorities Education and Families Committee, and that's one way that we've been able to represent young people in school at the local authority level. So that's another way that young people can have their voices heard by decision makers.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Can I bring Bruce in, please?
Thank you. And again, I think the young advisors have covered it really well. To come to the point in terms of what we need to learn kind of going forward, one of the things that's been positive, and so I'm still managing to virtually speak to lots of children and young people in groups and through schools and things. And it's a question I always ask them: are there any positives about your experience over the last year? And a lot of young people are pointing to some real positives about saying, for many, spending more time with family has been a real positive, and kind of building those family relationships. Children and young people have talked about a growing sense of kind of community solidarity, maybe getting to know their neighbours and their community a lot more, building communities online, whether it's kind of PE with Joe or whatever it is. Being part of something bigger is something that children have spoken a lot about. Drawing the rainbows in the windows, even things like clapping for the NHS and other things that children kind of really feeling more connected to their communities, that they're really keen that we hold on to as we go forward. I've talked about the fact that that technology has become a bigger part of adults' lives and actually kind of learning new skills. I think that the resilience that children have built up, we really need to celebrate and really encourage to flourish even more, because that's really powerful as well. And one of the really interesting things that I've heard from children and young people is whether they feel that some of the attitudes towards things like poverty might have changed in terms of the stigma that's associated with poverty, now that it's been seen as addressing poverty is being seen as an important way of addressing impact of coronavirus. Young people have said maybe some of these social attitudes that they're really concerned about, stigma around poverty, the looking at social security as a human right, maybe some of those values things could get taken forward as well. But there's also a huge amount of learning that we need in terms of what didn't go right that we need to change. And I appreciate we'll be coming on to some of this stuff, but I think disabled children and children with additional support needs, the real disproportionate impact on them generally, but particularly their education, is I think we've really struggled to get the support that they rely on in place for all disabled children and other children with additional support needs. We've talked many autistic children and other neurodiverse children and young people who the rules have been very, very difficult for, and perhaps they've been at greater risk of negative interactions with the police. So I think we need to learn a lot more around that as well. And I think some of the focus on mental health is absolutely important. Again, that was the other, poverty and mental health were the two biggest issues that we'd identified pre-COVID, and now we know it's so much worse. So that focus on getting support to each and every child and young person and their families, because parental mental health is hugely important, and how we do that is going to be one of the most important things we do coming out. And the other group that we haven't probably covered very much that I think is really important, two groups: care experienced young people have had a very different experience, and those in conflict with the law and the criminal justice system. Some real concerns about how we're failing to prioritise their rights, and the numbers of children who are insecure or indeed in young offenders institutions at the moment is really concerning, and we didn't do enough to focus on their rights and looking at other ways in which we could keep them safe. So there's a whole lot of things that I think that we can bring out of really positive learning about what we can do differently. And I think we absolutely owe it to children to listen to them about the positive things that they want to retain, as well as we plan what life's going to look like post-COVID.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jamie, in the interest of time, I was hoping that we could move on unless there's something that you...
That's fine.
Thank you. Can I move to Beatrice Wishart, who I believe has a question following on from this area?
Thanks, Deputy Convener. My question was around actually mental health, and good morning to the witnesses this morning. It's really been a very, very interesting discussion. On the mental health issue, can I just say that Jonathan, a fellow Shetlander, we have met on several occasions in our respective roles, and we most recently discussed mental health issues. And one of the points that Jonathan and his fellow MSYP colleague made was about in terms of preventative work, was about embedding emotional resilience and mental health and well-being within PSE lessons. So I wondered what if the other panelists had any views on that. And also, this isn't just a complete shout out for Shetland this morning, but I also met with a young group called Chillax, and they do peer-to-peer support. And they were doing this before the pandemic, and it was, again, it's about emotional resilience and supporting their peers. So I wonder how much more could be done through youth services. So I'd welcome any further thoughts on that from the panel.
Any of the panelists like to respond? Abigail, can I bring you in?
Hi. It's a very, I like this. There's a lot in these questions. It's you word them all very well. You're all very good at your jobs. Don't
tell them that, Abigail.
In terms of including more stuff about mental health and wellbeing in PSE, I completely agree with that, because I still feel like although we've come leaps and bounds, I think especially in the last few years in regards to stigma around mental health, it has to be done incredibly carefully. And I think that especially nowadays, I've noticed increasingly with a lot of young people that the stigma's still there, but among those who suffer from mental health issues, that it's become increasingly normalised to the point where those who don't suffer from it kind of believe that it's not as serious as it is laid out to be. And I think a lot of teachers as well, unfortunately, don't seem to understand the real impact of mental health on young people, especially in education and in senior education. So I completely agree with putting in more stuff about mental health and well-being, but in order for teachers to be able to teach kids in PSE, I think they have to have a greater understanding and more empathy and compassion towards these young people. And I don't know how much has been put in, if they talk to young people before they put in these measures in the current PSE lessons, because I know there is some. But I think you would have to talk to the young people to figure out what young people suffering from various mental health issues want other people to know in order to destigmatise, which I think is probably the main issue surrounding mental health, which is probably why a lot of people don't talk about it, because there is an increased stigma. I think the peer-to-peer thing, I've not read a whole lot on it. I know a little bit about it, and I think it's a really good idea. My school almost did it, and then I don't know what happened. I think we didn't have enough peers, so it fell through. But I volunteer with an organisation, and they do a peer education thing, and it seems to work really well. So I think something around that with mental health in schools would take away a lot of the fear of having to go up and talk to an adult who you don't think is going to understand, to talk to a peer. I think that if it was implemented in more schools, would be a real benefit to young people.
Thank you. Col, can I bring you in?
Yeah, totally, and I'll be really quick. I think that the point about using PSE is an incredibly kind of interesting one. I think that PSE is like the idea of giving children and young people a period a week of personal social education is spot on. It's amazing, and it could be so much better than it is. I feel like we're wasting PSE in that regard. I feel like there's still these perceptions taught in PSE of, you know, sex, drugs, and alcohol. It's the devil. That kind of idea is still there. It doesn't relate to mental health. I think that over lockdown we haven't had PSE. I think young people miss it. I think have missed out on it. And I think that perhaps in kind of making mental health more a part of PSE and peer-to-peer sounds incredible. I think that this could be part of a whole kind of wider analysis of how we can make PSE more inclusive and more a bit better in the aftermath of the pandemic, learning from what we have with regard to remote learning, and slightly more progressive, I think.
Thank you very much. Can I go back to Beatrice?
Thank you, both Paul and Abigail. That's very interesting points that you've made. And I took up on Abigail's point earlier about the stress and anxiety of with exams. And I know there's a lot of young people that may feel demotivated, and Col touched on it as well, about the pressure in going back and sort of a month of lots of assessments. So I wondered about how going forward, how you motivate people who have been demotivated over this experience.
Analysts? I'll go to Jonathan first, and then to Bruce and Abigail. Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. I think, speaking for lots of people like everywhere, motivation is such a difficult thing to get when you're online. Even outside of school, people working from home, I'm sure it's just not the same working environment. And going back to school, I think probably going on Col's point there about how there's a fear that next week and after the holidays, when we go back supposedly full time, that it will be assessments and all this. I think because this might be a lack of motivation, we need to recognise that when people go back to school and get back a few days to get back into a routine in school, so that everyone is can be their best when they are sitting any assessments or anything, so they're not disadvantaged by the cliff edge of coming from online learning at home to normal school again, just one day to the next day.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll go to Abigail and then finally Bruce. Abigail.
Sorry, I will be really quick. I'm aware I babble a lot. I think we've used this word a lot, but it is really important. I think clarity. I think knowing what you're studying for, knowing what you're working for, and not just doing it for nothing. Like, I think, speaking for a lot of my peers close to me, we had a lot of motivation for prelims that were supposed to happen before Christmas, which then didn't happen, and we were just told to keep studying for an indefinite amount of time. If you don't know what you're studying for, you don't know when, you don't know what anything's going towards, if you're not involved in knowing anything about your education, you're just told to shut up and get on with it. Sorry for using shut up, should have probably used a better phrase. But it's very hard to get motivation when it's very hard to retrieve now. I think when you've lost it, it's going to be very difficult. And I think, as Jonathan said, there needs to be adjustments and allowances made for those that are going back to school next week and have completely switched their life around. I know a lot of people that their siblings have laptops or computers during the day and they work throughout the night. So it's going to be a huge adjustment for them to then get back up and do schoolwork throughout the day. And I think that there needs to be allowances for that, and understanding that not everyone is going to have had the same experience with online learning, and therefore not everyone will be able to adjust quite as quickly to this onslaught of assessments that we are inevitably going to have when we go back.
Thank you. Bruce.
Gail's definition of babbling, I think, is far more articulate than many of us are able to do on any given day. So again, I think the young advisors have really captured this really well. It's important to recognise that this was one of the biggest human rights issues before COVID as well. It was the thematic work that the European Network of Ombudspersons for Children did back in 2018, and young advisors from Scotland, a previous group, were involved in that, highlighting it as one of the biggest concerns. It was something consistently that children and young people of every age group all across the country raised prior to COVID. And again, some of the responses to that, like the commitment to put more counsellors into schools, was really welcome. We need to really increase the investment in that, because that's one thing that young people have said very clearly that they think works, because it takes away maybe some of the stigma of having to access health-based systems. If you've got universal supports that are available in places like schools, I think the real huge asset that we have in Scotland of youth workers, we've got a really strong youth work sector, and the work that they're able to do in supporting young people's mental health, I think, really needs serious support and investment, and seeing that as a really essential part of the right to the highest attainable standard of health, but also the impact on every other aspect of children and young people's rights in their lives as well, in terms of mental health. The impact on your physical health is profound, the impact on your education is profound, the impact on your ability to socialise and develop is profound. And so prioritising investment and using all available resources to the maximum extent possible in supporting children's mental health, all children, not just those that perhaps need kind of clinical interventions and support, is the best investment that we can make at the moment, because the risk of not putting in place those supports is going to be catastrophic. And so every single child, young person and their families needs to be able to get some support, someone who's able to build up a relationship of trust with them, and figure out how best to support them, and building on the real strengths that children and young people have told me about in terms of the pride that they've taken in themselves over the last year of adapting and sticking to the rules and supporting their families, and recognising the big impact of parental mental health over the last year as well, as parents have been really struggling, and the huge strengths that children have shown in supporting their parents and supporting their siblings through what has been a horrible experience. And so building on that strength that we've got all across Scotland, but I think in investment terms, we need to get trusted professionals in and around children and young people to do an assessment of what they need and how best to support them. And I think youth work's really important, things like sports clubs and others, getting the investments into the places where children are is the most important thing that we can do, alongside strengthening some of the clinical responses. And again, we've heard from NHS colleagues and paediatrics in terms of saying that mental health referrals are now higher than physical health referrals coming through in paediatrics, and that's hugely concerning. So we need to focus on both, but I'd really stress the point of investment in things like youth work, school-based counselling, the things that get in and around supporting families are the best possible investment that we can make over the next few months and years.
Great. Just keeping an eye on time, the committee can go past the 11 o'clock mark, so I'm not overly concerned with that, but we do probably need to be mindful. But so on that note, Beatrice, does that cover off the main line of questions, or would you like me to try to come back to you at the end?
If there's time at the end, I've got other questions, but no, colleagues have got to need to have their opportunity too.
Great. Well, I'll bring in the convener, because I believe she has questions relating to this area too.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for stepping in this morning. I have been able to catch most of the committee, and I just want to say thank you so much. What a really, really good session, and how invaluable the contributions from the advisors has been today. I just wanted to link it a wee bit back to some of the work that the committee has been doing. So I heard what Abigail was saying about the pressures of exams and everything. Now, of course, we're all awaiting the outcome of the OECD review of the final phase and of Curriculum for Excellence. And for the next session of Parliament, I'm sure that's something that will come to the fore. I'm really pleased to hear the positive comments from Bruce and Jonathan about the counsellors. And just to say, we had been undertaking some investigation work on that as a committee. We were due to visit Wales, who rolled out a similar system earlier, and unfortunately, like everything, COVID had its impact in that. We haven't been able to continue that work, but it's something that will be featuring in our legacy paper as well. And really, to go back to the Jonathan's very opening remarks, they said something that I found quite profound, in that he said that he felt that it allowed him to engage more COVID because he had been excluded from meetings and everything like this. And the Parliament itself will have to think about how we go forward in the future. Certainly, we've had a very vocal contribution from a colleague, Gail Ross, who lives in the North East, and has said that everything she asked for to make her life easier to engage in the Parliament, was told it wasn't possible, became possible under COVID. And it's really to ask people how they think the positives of this can go forward. And I'm thinking of our other work on subject choices as well. Do you think it would be easier if your school you wanted to study a subject that wasn't available, that now we have sort of best practice to pull on to make that possible? And how will you be able to engage more in the wider society with people like the Children's Commission or Youth Parliament, other organisations, uniformed organisations, as a result of us learning from the experience of people being able to participate? And I think I'll go to Jonathan first for that. Thanks.
Jonathan.
Thank you. Just to make it clear, I've never actually been excluded from any meetings when we did have in person due to transport. But like, I feel like because my travel costs or anything wasn't like a burden on me, and also because we were able to have meetings more frequently, this was in other opportunities I have been excluded due to the geography of where I live, but that's not the case with Bruce's office. We've been very inclusive for me, which is appreciated. Yeah, going forward, like definitely online communication has come forward so far, you know, since what it used to be, and that's definitely opening so many opportunities. But I think it's important that we make sure that children and young people are happy with if it is online or if it's in person, and they're listened to on that, and also if they're comfortable with taking part online, even if after the pandemic, through through school and external opportunities. I think young people must be listened to on that.
Thank you, Jonathan. Col, can I bring you in on this topic?
Yeah, I think that the point about subject choice is incredibly important. Like, I'm in the Borders, so I appreciate that completely. I've never found it fair that purely because of where I live in my catchment area, I cannot do subjects that people in the city can, whether that be throughout BGE or at a kind of exam level. And I think that there is huge potential to do. It's not something I'd thought about actually. So the potential to do kind of virtual and online education for subjects that aren't available rurally would be incredible. Like, I think that there is a general feeling in rural schools that we are cut off from subjects we'd like to do. I mean, the Edinburgh and Glasgow schools have incredible array of subjects that rural schools just don't, through no fault of their own, but through how remote they are. And the prospect of online learning for subjects is incredible, and I think that it would be incredibly popular amongst young people who have, in rural areas, been cut off from subjects that they would like to do purely by virtue of where they live.
Thank you very much. Claire, can I bring you back in?
Yeah, I'm fine, and just just to repeat my thanks for the session this morning. It's been really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, can I come to Oliver Mundell, please?
Thank you, Deputy Convener. I'm interested to follow up on the issues of rurality. I feel very strongly that the pandemic has exposed the challenges that face young people in rural areas with poor digital connectivity and just a sense of remoteness and isolation, with many people, not having friends, just on their doorstep in the same way as people might imagine. And I just wanted to understand from the panelists, what they felt about that, and if they felt that was an issue moving forward.
Can I ask any of the panelists would like to respond? Jonathan.
Yeah, definitely. Like, connectivity is an issue in my community, but I'm sure in bigger Cause, in the borders, and that, because it's sometimes viewed like where I live, as an island. It's far away. But myself, I have pretty good internet, but it's definitely an issue here because in further out areas, and sometimes if it might be seen as one person has good internet in that area, everybody does, and that's not necessarily, that's never true. And the same case on the Scottish mainland. I'm sure if in Edinburgh there's one person that has good internet, then it's assumed that lots of people do, and that's never usually taken into account. And maybe we need to look at that through schools as well, to see if young people, if teachers know which young people have connectivity issues, so that they can fully support them in the future with online learning and different things.
Thank you, Jonathan. In the absence of any of the other young advisors come in, I will come back to Bruce, but I'm doing that very reluctantly. I'll have Bruce note.
I take your reluctance with the spirit with which it was intended. This is a really important point, and in fact, just last weekend I was at a session with the Scottish Rural Parliament with young people, and I think that was really interesting, because a lot of the young people in rural communities were talking about the real strengths of being in rural communities, and a lot of the schools that I've been visiting virtually in rural communities as well have highlighted that, and that their experience of lockdown's been a bit different, and that they've maybe had more access to open spaces and the environment and things like that, but generally further away from their friends. The connectivity is absolutely key, and that kind of sense of isolation and the impact on mental health. But again, these pre-existed COVID, and to some extent there was a comment that I found very interesting is from some young people who said that they felt maybe other young people were experiencing what they were already experiencing, the sense of kind of isolation and disconnection, and in fact they were better placed because they've been used to this, they've been used to having the issues. And it's not to say that we don't need to address the underlying issues, but I was hugely impressed with the kind of strength-based approach that the young people from the Scottish Youth Parliament session, but also the young people from the schools, kind of primary schools as well, have talked about the real strengths. And one of the huge amazing things about Scotland is the beauty and the rural communities, and talking about crofting, talking about the environment, talking about our coasts. And young people are such huge champions for Scotland that many of the children in rural communities have talked to me about, they've had some of the most positive experiences in many ways of the pandemic because of the advantages that they've been able to talk about of being in rural community, and the real strengths of rural community, already that some of that inbuilt sense of community and sense of solidarity and helping each other, but also focused very much on the challenges with digital technology and also because of the distances to travel. And again, some young people have talked to me about some of the challenges with the current restrictions, where you're living on a local authority border and maybe your friends or your school are across the border, and how some of those restrictions or the need to travel kind of longer distances to see friends, and concern that might put you at risk of breaking the rules. And so some of those things I think need more work. But as I say, hugely impressed with the strength-based approach that the young people in rural communities have talked about. And I think capturing that, so improving the digital connectivity, including the physical connectivity as well, which is a big issue anytime you speak to children and young people in rural communities. A lot of conversation about transport, quite understandably. But I think they're a really powerful voice in how we go forward. And what's really impressed me is that they've got lots of ideas that I think are a huge benefit to children in urban communities, about how you build digital connectivity, how you have this kind of approach, and also the real love and passion for the environment, which we know is so important for that mental health link.
Thank you very much. Can I come back to Oliver?
Thank you, Deputy Convener. No, I think that's a helpful answer. I want to ask something at the other end of the spectrum, which is maybe more for the Commissioner than for the young people here. But I'm particularly concerned, at this sort of early years stage, or the kind of newborn, just the experience, for very small children, who are often, they're kind of missing out, I guess, if they don't go to a formal childcare setting, or they don't fall within one of the exceptions. There are a lot of young children who have very limited contact with family, friends, and others. And it's just whether that was something that was on the Commissioner's radar as we start to look at what opportunities there are to ease restrictions.
Very, very much so. And we know just how important those early years are. And I think that one of the big concerns has been around ensuring support pre-birth. So all of the supports that we need to get to mothers and to families before children are born, and then that very intensive support that's needed. And that has been a real challenge. The experience for anyone who has had a new baby over the last year is very different in terms of being able to access that support, and particularly the kind of community-based supports. And so it's welcome that there have been some kind of changes to try and focus on the need for that. But it's a very difficult time for anyone, and particularly in the restrictions that we've had at the moment. And so again, the focus needs to be on ensuring good parental mental health, getting those supports in. And I think health visitors and community nursing does an incredible job with this. But it's about getting that support to the family around that child, and then making sure that some of that particularly kind of socialization and development happens and is really structured. And again, talking to parents about the fact that their babies aren't used to seeing other children. And so even kind of going out and some of that, we're going to need to pay very careful attention to that. And again, that's a really important investment that we need to make in early years. Lots of the focus, quite understandably, has been focused around schools because they do so much in terms of supporting children's rights. But we need to be looking outside of the formal structures as well to make sure the community-based services are there as well, that can go in and get around the family and provide them with the support that they need. And so that's another area where we need to be very clear about using resources effectively to support families in early years.
Thank you very much. And can I now move on to Ross Greer? Ross, can I bring you?
Thank you, Deputy Convener. I've got two questions. I think for the interest of time, I'll maybe direct the first one towards our young advisors and the second one to Bruce. There's been quite a consistent theme this morning about communication with young people from the state, whether it's directly from the government, from local authorities, schools, the SQA, etc., not being as good as it needs to be, certainly in the last year. There are often challenges with that. I mean, we as MSPs are familiar. We get many complaints in our inboxes from young people and from teachers who are really frustrated when they find out about a major change in education because they've seen it on the news or on social media. Sometimes that's unavoidable because the biggest changes have to be announced to Parliament first, and obviously the moment they're announced, that's reported. But there are other occasions where I think we would strongly agree that communication with either young people themselves or with their teachers hadn't been strong enough. But my question for you is, how do we improve communication, for example, between the SQA and pupils directly? It's been mentioned, there's now a young person on the Education Recovery Group. That's fantastic, but it's obviously not Liam's role there to then go and communicate with every other young person in Scotland. So how can public bodies like the SQA more effectively communicate directly with young people rather than through proxies where it's clearly getting lost if they're expecting it to go through a council and then go through a school and then eventually get to the young people?
I think Ross was hoping the young advisors would respond to that. Jonathan, would you like to come in first?
So I start this off here. Communication is really, really important, and I think, knowing that SQA they usually work through schools anyway. I think it must be difficult for SQA to directly contact young people, but I feel maybe that is the best way, because when you see it's from SQA, it's them, whereas through the school it's not necessarily clear. Well, first of all, if young people actually get things from the school, if it's sent to their parents or whatever, it doesn't always reach young people. But if it came straight directly from SQA, it would be clear who it's from. So I'm not too sure because it's SQA, but SQA directly contacting the young person, maybe through the post, because obviously SQA do have the addresses of people to send out certificates, but I think on the whole, SQA don't really have too much in terms of being able to contact young people at the moment.
Thank you. Cole.
I think what Jonathan says is spot on. I also think that as part of communication, we need to properly brief teachers, because there is the amount. I feel so sorry for teachers that you ask. They are the only people who young people have to ask questions to about education and about what's going on, about what units of courses are going to be dropped and what's aren't. They are the only possible kind of immediately accessible person to put those questions to, but they are as uninformed as us, I think. And I think that whilst the communication in certain schools might need work, I think if we could work at a structure where schools are briefed properly and in full, and thus teachers briefed in full, they would be able to field young people's questions in a way in which we felt more informed and not kind of on a cliff edge. That'd be my suggestion.
Abigail.
I think what Carl says definitely about informing teachers and informing schools, because the first thing you hear, if you hear about something about education, the first thing you're going to do is go to a teacher and ask them. I feel so sorry for my biology teacher, because this year that's all she's had, and every time she just says, I don't know, I know even less than you. Sometimes we go to her with information that she hasn't even heard yet, which is pretty atrocious. I think email and social media directly from the SQA can really go a long way here, because the amount of times I had a wee Instagram advert from the SQA saying, take a survey on our new website, evaluate the new website, learners, this is for you. You see it a lot. I don't think it would be, I'm just saying, for me and my peers, I'm sure social media is probably the best way to go. Not all of us check our email every day. Some people do. I think email would be a good idea. Post also a good idea. Not sure about the practicalities of it though, but it's a good idea. I think social media is probably your best way to go, because you just have to make sure that you know it's from a reliable source. I'm much more likely to see SQA official Instagram, Facebook, Twitter page than I am to believe some random second year on Facebook that's going on a wee rant. I think there's issues to work around, but I think the SQA is so untrusted at this point that this is a huge step that they would need to take in order for young people to start being more involved and building that trust again.
Thank you. Ross, can I come back to you?
Yeah, thank you. I think that was all really valuable and useful. And Abigail's final point around the SQAs need to rebuild trust, I think, is going to be critical for them, not just in the short term, but for years to come. Second question is going back a little bit, so I think it's probably best directed to Bruce, is around the SQA's historical familiarity with things like equality impact assessments, child's right impact assessments. It seemed, I found it, certainly sitting on this committee over the last year, very, very hard to piece together the process the SQA were following for last year's alternative assessment model. I got the distinct impression, though, including based on some of the things coming from your office, that the SQA were not nearly as familiar with equality impact processes as they should have been. Are you able to comment on that? What, from your engagement with the SQA, what has your office been able to understand about their processes in this regard?
Bruce.
It's been very challenging because one of the concerns we had last year is that engagement was pretty limited. It was quite hard to kind of have those conversations, and obviously do understand the pressure that everyone was working under. But in terms of the understanding of the use of children's rights impact assessments and equality impact assessments not being kind of bureaucratic or procedural barriers to decision making, but rather an essential part of good decision making and legitimate decision making, and particularly including within an impact assessment the voice of those affected. And I think that I was deeply concerned about SQA not taking that approach. But again, that was consistent across other decision makers as well. It wasn't unique to SQA, but particularly where it was very easy to identify the young people affected, not having them involved and not taking an impact assessment approach, which would have allowed them to figure out some of the issues in advance. And allowed to kind of open kind of better dialogue and communication would have been much better. So I think that it's absolutely essential to use these types of tools. And for our own part, we've been trying to provide support through the work we did on the independent children's rights impact assessment, but also at the European level, we've developed a common framework of reference, which has been endorsed now by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, for all states at all levels to be using this approach. So the tools are there. Where I think maybe I need to do better and we need to do better is ensuring that decision makers like the SQA understand the benefits and the necessity of taking this type of approach to avoid the breaches in children's rights that we saw last year and that are at risk of continuing this year.
Thank you. Ross, do you have anything further you'd like to ask?
Yeah, just briefly following that, I mean, we're still seeing your office has been very clear about the risk, particularly the appeals process this year, resulting in further violations of children and young people's rights. Does that then mean that there's not been a significant improvement from the SQA in how they engage with your office and the support that you're trying to provide with them? I'm trying to understand if they have learned from what happened last year and are trying to improve their processes.
I think there's still a long way to go. Is what I would say. I think that overall the work that's being done around education is kind of drastically improved. I think there's still a very long way to go to ensure that the model of assessment is appropriate and is rights respecting. And so the current days and weeks are absolutely essential, because what we're hearing from children and young people, and you've heard directly from the young advisors, is that we're still not where we need to be in terms of clarity of what the process is, in terms of the support to the schools, and in terms of ensuring that there's that right to a remedy as well. And what I think is really important to say is that I think teachers, school leadership, early years, those that are working in early years have done a phenomenal job over the last year. And the real challenging situation that they find themselves in as being the direct point of contact with young people, without proper guidance, without clarity of what's needed, I think puts them in a really impossible situation. So we're committed to continuing to work with SQA and Scottish Government, obviously, as the ultimate responsibility to ensure the right to an education, including the right to have proper recognition of achievement to allow you to move on to further and higher education or to employment opportunities. as well. But we're not where we need to be yet, no.
Thank you.
Ross. Thank you. And on that note, I mean, I recognise that the election is coming at a very awkward time for the exam diet, but the issues that I think Bruce has just highlighted are ones that the committee has a long-standing concern and interest in. So please do stay in correspondence with the committee. And I think we would be very eager to reinforce any of those points of communication, clarification, and indeed improvement that Bruce is seeking with the SQA and more broadly with education in the coming weeks and months. Just in the interest of time, I know that both Beatrice and Jamie would like to ask supplementaries. Could I ask them to be brief? Apart from anything else, I wouldn't mind asking a couple of questions myself. Beatrice, first of all.
Thanks, Deputy Convener. It was just on the point of comms, and in Bruce's submission to the committee, he's got a quote here from Hope, the young advisor, who says, "I feel too often that young people are used by politicians to keep their comms teams happy and to keep up public appearance. People seem to be very happy to have children active within politics until they disagree." I just wonder what our young advisors might say to that after we've listened to their very compelling evidence this morning.
Paul was quickest on the button there. Paul, can I bring you in?
I think it remains to be seen. Although I'd echo Hope's sentiment. I think that we shall see what happens with regard to exams and the exam culture. I think that it is widely accepted now that it doesn't work for young people, and I've said that today, but I'll say it again. And I think that we can judge how well we've been listened to, not just listened to, but our concerns have been acted upon by the response to 2 years without exams and how we build forward with that. And it's a chance to, I don't know, prove Hope and I wrong, and then and move forward with exams, I think.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks. Very briefly as well. I would agree with Paul and Hope in the large scale things, but I think first of all, thanks to the committee for inviting us as young people to give evidence today at the committee, and I think that's really important that we've have given this platform to speak up about children's rights, and that's really positive. But also, as Paul says, it's to be seen whether the SQA in these surveys that they've done on different things, also politicians and the government, to see whether they will value young people in what they say towards the appeals process, which is yet to be revealed for this next year, and the exam diets and etc. in years to come.
Thank you. Unless there's any other anyone else wanted to come in, I'll move on. Jamie, would you like to ask your supplementary?
Thank you, Deputy Convener. I appreciate that. And can I thank the young people who have joined us today? I think we often hear as a committee from experts, agencies and ministers, but it's great to hear straight directly from young people the experiences of the past year. But I think linked to that, one of the things I've noticed throughout this past 12 months, sitting in a lot of these updates and statements from the government, is this direct link between restrictions, lockdowns and young people. For example, we've heard repeatedly that if we accept that if we close businesses and shops and gyms and churches, it means that we can open up nurseries and schools, and that link's been made. And then when schools do reopen, there's a potential that it will drive the R number back up and the virus will increase in the community again. So can I ask, do you think that this link, or indeed this narrative, has unduly apportioned any blame or guilt or responsibility on young people? Or do you think it unfairly singles them out as either as drivers or reasons for lockdowns in the rest of society?
Anyone like to come in? That's a tough one. Abigail.
I definitely think that there is potential for that to happen. I also firmly believe that, as Cole said at the very beginning, we're already seen as the villains. I highly doubt that anyone is probably going to change their view on that, because if we do indeed go back to school, and inevitably I think it will drive the R rate up, it's going to happen. As Carl said, it's so unbelievably difficult to do social distancing in a school where you've got upwards of 1,000 pupils. It will arguably, there will be more cases and we will get blamed for it. But I think you could also say that about anything. I think if you opened up only churches again, everyone would blame everyone that follows a religion. You know, it's just unfortunate that that's the way that society kind of is. I think it's just a good thing that we are opening schools up. I think that we can cope with the hate from the other generations, because we're going to be back, and this is a step towards normality again.
Thank you. Cole.
Yeah, I totally agree with Abigail. I also think that there's young people understand the need to have schools closed and the need to have them reopened. But I think that we wanted schools to shut before schools shut in March. We wanted schools to shut before there were plans about coming back after Christmas. I think that whilst there is a perception that maybe we are the villains by going back to school, I think that at the same time we are totally understanding of the fact that our schools have to close because they are vectors of transmission, and we spent too long denying that schools could lead to transmission. I think that didn't help anyone. So I think that's what I would say, and I'd echo Jonathan's thanks for having us today.
And Bruce.
Thanks. I think this is a really important point. I sit on a technical advisory group for the World Health Organization on the opening of schools at a European level. And one of the things that's very clear from the evidence is that that schools follow community transmission rather than being drivers of community transmission. So we've got a lot more of the kind of scientific kind of research that's been done over the last year to help us understand it's really important that schools can reopen safely, and that we're supporting school communities to put in place other mitigation measures against COVID, and again all the restrictions around congregation at school gates and things like that. But it is really important that when we're putting in place restrictions, they need to be necessary and proportionate. And as the young advisors have said, children and young people really understand the necessity of this. And why there have needed to be restrictions, but we need to make sure that they're only in place for as long as we need them. And we also need to recognise the impact of school buildings being closed, being not just on education, but on all of the kind of broader elements that school communities provide, and the incredible human rights work that schools do generally. But we were very concerned last year about some of the rhetoric of blame around young people. And again, some of the things around breaching the other kind of socialisation rules, whereas the work with Police Scotland shows very clearly that children and young people were not the ones that were breaking the rules. The level of sticking to the rules has been very, very high for children and young people have understood the sacrifices they've been making, and so it's been wrong that blame's been apportioned towards them. It's wrong that blame's apportioned to schools opening and driving up numbers, because the evidence doesn't show that. The evidence shows that schools follow community transmission levels rather than drive them. So we strongly support the government's decision, and again across Parliament, of focusing on getting schools and early years open, as well as we need to be focusing on those other community-based supports, including things like sport and drama and things, to open safely because of the impacts on children's rights in terms of both education, but also development and mental health as well. And we need to be very clear that children and young people have been amongst the heroes of this pandemic and our response to it, by sticking to the rules so well, and by being a real part of this collective effort to keep everyone safe. And so we strongly need to avoid any further kind of stigmatisation of children and young people, because of the focus on the real importance of getting them back to a better sense of normality.
Very, very well said. Thank you
very much. And if the committee can bear with me, I was just wondering if I could just ask some questions just at the end. And in a sense, following on from some of the topics previously covered, ASN has been an ongoing topic that this committee has focused on And indeed, some of the work that we have not been able to because of the pandemic to do with ASN in schools, and also Joanne Lamont's bill on transitions from schools. But I wonder, just building on something Bruce said earlier, whether or not there's been sufficient focus on the particular impact of particular young people with conditions such as autism. And I'm very pleased that Bruce specifically mentioned neurodiversity and neurodiverse young people. Being a neurodiverse person myself, I mean, thinking particularly measures such as face masks are something that people with autism very much struggle with. Likewise, online learning can be incredibly challenging for people with autism and ADHD. I know I personally have deep struggles with sitting in front of a screen for such prolonged periods of time. Is that something that there needs to be particular concentration on? And indeed, is there actually a wider issue here within this? I think there's a growing sense that while ASN is useful because it's a broad category, that sometimes we miss the fine detail of the different requirements of people within that category. I'd just be interested if the panelists had comments on those impacts and ongoing thoughts. Abigail.
I think there's definitely not enough focus at all. It's not something I have personal experience of, so I will not go too much on it. But I do know of young people that have really struggled to get a lot of work done, and a lot of teachers are not particularly accommodating to the fact that it might be very difficult for some people. There's not enough differentiated learning. It's all on a screen. It's all, for some schools, it's all face on a screen. For some, it's all just looking at a PowerPoint. For some, it's all listening to an audio. And I think what a couple of young people that I do know that are deaf have really suffered from that, because it's very difficult to hear through headphones or to lip read through face masks at school. It's incredibly difficult, and teachers don't wear clear face masks. Peers don't wear clear face masks. So I know that that's an issue. And I think a lot of people that are neurodivergent have been really disadvantaged. And although I feel that young people have been overlooked in some way, I think people with additional support needs have been even more overlooked, which is really saying something.
Thank you, Abigail. And Bruce.
Thank you. I think this is a really important point, and something we've been discussing for a very long time. I think while the broad definition of additional support needs is useful in some senses, I agree with you that there's a risk that in it that you lose the focus on the rights and the needs of particular groups of children, or particular children, in fact, within that very, very broad definition. And so when we're talking about disabled children, we need to focus on the support that they need. We need to work with their families and understand them. My office has done a lot of work on this. That's different from the broader cohort of additional support needs. And so if we're focusing on the needs of disabled children, we should be talking about disabled children rather than using the additional support needs term, which covers so much more broadly. And I think neurodiversity and our growing understanding of neurodiversity and the strong calls that we've heard from autistic children and young people and other neurodiverse children and young people, we need to do much better at listening to those. I think the online thing is interesting because some disabled children and their families have talked about advantages of online learning. I think we need to do a lot of focus on what quality online learning looks like for all children and how we can make it work, because the one size fits all approach, which doesn't work, I think, as the young advisors have said. And while we've seen really significant improvement in online learning over the last year, that hasn't met the needs of all. And also recognizing that there may be some disabled children who are more likely not to be back at school because they're in situations where their health might be at risk, or for other reasons. And so making sure that we're tailoring online learning or other supports to make sure that disabled children, neurodiverse children, and other additional support needs are getting the support that they need that works best for them. So a focus on quality online learning that is adaptable. And again, you'll recall from the paper that that our office sent in relation to education, one of the ways in which the right to education is assessed in terms of its adaptability. So it needs to be accessible and also needs to be adaptable to take into account the different needs and the different ways of learning. And I think that's probably where there's been a big gap. And I think that the work that's been going on by the committee with Joanne Lamont's bill on transition, these are really important conversations that need to continue into the next Parliament, because we've not made the progress that I think any of us had hoped that we would. And absolutely at the heart of that is the participation of children, young people and their families, neurodiverse children, young people, other disabled children, is absolutely essential. And just consulting them isn't the same as kind of active participation. So they're in an amazing position as human rights defenders to show real leadership in this. And I think that's where I'd like to see a big focus in the next session of Parliament as we all continue our work on getting them right at the heart of these discussions and designing a system in education terms which is adaptable to what they need to fully implement the right to an education which develops every child and young person to their fullest potential.
Thank you very much. And that actually leads me neatly on to my final question, the final question for the session. Next week, the committee will be coming together to discuss its legacy paper. And today has been a fantastic opportunity for us to hear directly from young people. And while we've talked a lot this morning about the need for various bodies to improve their communication and improve their ability to hear directly from young people, we haven't necessarily discussed whether or not this committee is doing as much as it could. So as a final question, can I ask panellists and Bruce if they could maybe make some suggestions to the committee about what it could do in the next session of Parliament to improve its ability to hear from young people and allow them to directly participate in the work that we do. Do you have any thoughts or ideas for the committee? Colin.
The obvious answer is more sessions like today. I think if you guys can make an effort to have young people involved from a variety of sectors, that's the word, whether it be care experienced young people or across the board, I think that would be an incredible measure that you guys could take, and it would be active participation for young people and another kind of outlet for them. Maybe less experts, more young people would be my advice.
Thank you. Jonathan.
I think mine's quite a brief point, but maybe not so much the committee, but the Parliament in general. Like, I feel like the remit of the committee could be maybe a bit more clear, because obviously it's the education and skills committee, but like today we've been discussing the things beyond education, and maybe it's just to go across to broader young people, and that to know that this like committees in Parliament, what they discuss maybe in education people in school about that, but make it clear that like this what the committee discusses and how that affects young people.
Thank you, Jonathan. I know you've not put an R in, but Abigail, do you have any sort of comments on this or any final thoughts just at the end of the session?
I think everything I have to say has already been said. Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you for coming. And finally, Bruce.
Thank you. I think it's a really important point, and I would like to really recognise the amazing work this committee and other parliamentary committees have done over this session to try and improve the way in which children and young people are involved. And again, I know the Parliament's looking at this more broadly. It's absolutely essential to address the democratic deficit that exists and to give life to children's rights to be involved in every decision that affects them. I think sessions like today with the very articulate and brilliant young advisors that we have are a good example of one model, but where I think that there's a really strong opportunity is to tap into the amazing expertise that we have in participation in Scotland with civil society. I would love to see a lot more of MSPs sitting on the floor playing with Play-Doh and Lego and glitter and all the things that I get to do generally before COVID. And using all the creative tools of actually finding out what's really important to children and young people. That can't happen around a committee room table, but there's huge potential for you, and I know with huge respect that you all do that within your constituencies and the leadership you provide within your communities. But I think as part of the parliamentary work, I would really like to see the kind of creativity, the going out to the communities, and it does require adults to go outside of their comfort zone. It does require children to be designing the processes with you in order for them to kind of fully engage. And so I'd love to see that as a priority kind of in the next session of Parliament, that Parliament works with children and young people and co-designs with the amazing support of civil society ways in which you can do the kind of innovative participation work to find out children and young people of all ages, right down to early years, to find out what's important, kind of working with families. And I think that really does give life to the values of the Parliament as well. And so I think that's really exciting, and it's fun and it works. And I know that you all understand this, but I think that's really important to me, is that it can't be done just around the committee table, as important as that is, and how well many young people are able to do that. It has to be in places where children feel comfortable, where children feel that they've got the power and they're in charge. And that's what's so exciting about the opportunity next week to incorporate the Convention on the Rights of the Child into our domestic law, which is at stage 3 next week, because that's right at the heart of the commitment that the Scottish Parliament will be making to take an approach that ensures that children can participate fully in all decisions that affect them. And that's going to require change on behalf of everyone who currently exercises power. So that's really exciting. And I think it does link to the kind of underlying question that sat right at the heart of this whole session, is in terms of what does the future look like for children and young people as we come out of COVID. And again, in our written submission, we talked about some concerns about this idea about branding things as kind of catching up, or that children have missed out. And we really need to take a really strengths-based approach in terms of saying that children and young people have given amazing commitment, they've shown incredible resilience. What can we do to best support them, particularly around socialisation and mental health, as well as educational achievement, to take them where they want to go? And that real focus on an holistic understanding of how we can best support children and young people is going to be absolutely essential. And it only works when children and young people have power to be involved in those decision making. So I think it's despite all of the huge challenges and the difficulties over the last year, I'm really optimistic about how we can use the incredible talent of children and young people to make Scotland the place we all want it to be.
Thank you very much. And with that final remark, I'm now going to worry the clerks by making the suggestion that the committee thinks about how we can incorporate glitter, both figuratively and literally, into our legacy report. But with that, we have completed our questions. Can I say a huge thank you to Col, Jonathan, Abigail, and finally Bruce for their contributions this morning. I think we've touched a broad range of topics, both things I think we need to take up more immediately, but also I think some very important thoughts and insights for the future and our ongoing work, and indeed that of our legacy or successor committee, I should say. Next week's committee will be held entirely in private to allow the committee to consider its legacy paper, and I've no doubt that the comments and discussion today will inform that a great deal. As previously agreed, the committee will now move into private session, but can I just say a final thank you to all our panellists this morning. That has been a really incredibly useful session. Thank you very much, and we'll now move into private session and we'll just take a 5-minute break before we go on to Teams for that private session. So I'll see the rest of the committee very approximately 20 minutes to 12. Thank you very much, everyone.